The rain came down like a punishment from the sky. Italy, winter of 1944. The battlefield near the Liri Valley had turned into a sea of brown, sucking earth. American voices screamed through static-filled radios, "We're sinking!" The camera would shake as the ground itself quivered beneath a column of Sherman tanks, each one a 30-ton beast fighting for breath in the storm. In the middle of it all, one tank began to spin. The men inside thought it was the end. The heavy turret swung, the mud surged, and for a second, it looked like the machine would topple into the flood. But instead, it moved. The Sherman slid sideways across the bog, its treads carving a perfect curve. Mud fanned out like the wake of a ship. For those who saw it, the war paused. No longer a battle between men and machines, but a dance. Steel and soil intertwined, chaos tamed by motion. The crew stared in disbelief. Outside, the storm howled, shells whistled, but inside that spinning tank, a rhythm was born. It was the rhythm of defiance, the rhythm of a man who refused to sink. That man's name was Frank Davis. To history, he was just a number on a manifest from the 752nd Tank Battalion. But to those who witnessed it, he was the man who made a 30-ton machine glide like a bird, and his question still lingers across decades of mud and memory. How did one man make a monster of steel dance through the storm? If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And as you're watching, tell us in the comments, where are you and what time is it where you are right now? Frank Davis had grown up where dust and engines spoke the same language. Before the war, he raced dirt track cars in Texas, old Fords held together with wire and prayer. On weekends, he'd spend hours sliding through the red clay outside Abilene, learning to feel the road not with his eyes, but through the trembling of the steering wheel. He once told his mechanic, "Every road has its rhythm, even the ones trying to swallow you." That sentence, thrown away in youth, would return to him years later under the thunder of war. By 1944, Davis sat behind the steel wheel of a Sherman M4A3. The tank was no racer. It weighed 30 tons, carried a 75mm gun, and drank fuel like a dying horse gasps for air. But Davis treated it the way he once treated his dirt cars, not as a machine to control, but as a partner to understand. He felt the hum of the engine through his boots, listened to the pitch of the treads, and sensed when the mud pulled harder on one side than the other. While others wrestled their tanks like beasts, he danced with his. The day the storm hit, Davis didn't see mud, he saw rhythm. The churn of the engine, the resistance of the ground, the pull of gravity, all had a beat, and he found it. When the left tread lost grip, he countered with the right. When the nose dipped, he let it slide before throttling back. He moved with the storm, not against it. To the crew, it felt like magic. Private Jenkins, the loader, later wrote in his field diary, "The tank swayed like a drunk, then suddenly caught a tune we couldn't hear. I thought we were dying, but Frank just smiled, like he'd heard a song in the mud." That was the secret. Not training, not luck, but an instinct born from years of dirt roads and broken engines. In that instant, the boundary between man and machine blurred. Physics bowed to intuition. And when Davis finally steered the Sherman onto firmer ground, he didn't raise his arms or shout. He just took a breath, leaned back, and whispered something his gunner barely heard over the rain. "Told you? Every road's got a rhythm." It was the moment when skill became art, when engineering and instinct fused into something beyond reason. At first, the other soldiers thought he had lost his mind. From a distance, it looked like Davis was spinning the tank for fun, showing off in the middle of chaos. The platoon sergeant cursed over the radio, "Tell that fool to quit dancing before he kills us all." Laughter crackled through the storm. A short, nervous kind of laughter that always comes before tragedy. But then, silence. The Sherman that had seemed doomed moments earlier began to move with uncanny grace. The entire machine slid sideways through the flooded trench, the hull nearly scraping the mud wall. The turret balanced like the head of a performer keeping time. Rain poured down, bullets hissed in the air, and yet the tank floated forward. The laughter died in the throats of the men watching. From another vehicle, Corporal Reed saw it happen. Years later, he told a journalist, "It didn't look real. It was like watching a man waltz with a ghost." That day, something changed in how the crew and the entire battalion saw their machines. They were no longer trapped in steel coffins. For a brief, shattering moment, they were part of something alive. Private Jenkins, still shaking from inside the Sherman, later scrawled a single line in his diary: "I saw something beautiful inside hell." The words spread across the company like wildfire. Some laughed again, others stayed quiet. No one could quite explain it, how beauty could appear in a world of death and mud. But the image of that tank sliding through the storm stuck in every man's mind. That night, as they bivouacked near Casino, the sound of rain on metal became a lullaby instead of a warning. The men spoke softly, still haunted by what they'd seen. A tank that shouldn't have moved at all had danced its way through death. For many who fought in Italy, that memory lingered longer than gunfire or victory, because in that single fleeting moment, something pure had emerged. Proof that even amid destruction, there was room for rhythm, grace, and a kind of defiance no weapon could destroy. No academy on earth had ever taught what Frank Davis did that day. There were manuals about clutch control, brake pressure, torque balance, but none about making a 30-ton tank slide on purpose. And yet, in that chaos, he believed in something beyond the textbooks. He trusted the invisible rules of motion the same way a preacher trusts scripture. When engineers later studied the event, they were stunned. The after-action report described the Sherman's movement as a balanced transition between traction and inertia. The data showed something no one had anticipated. By feathering one brake and throttling at half power, Davis had created a near-perfect equilibrium between friction and centrifugal force. He hadn't known the formulas. He had felt them. At the maintenance depot in Naples, mechanics examined the treads and gearboxes, expecting damage. Instead, they found an even wear pattern, as if the tank had skated across the mud rather than dug through it. Lieutenant Harold Finch, an ordnance engineer, wrote in his notes, "He achieved what we thought impossible, motion without resistance. Faith became physics." That sentence spread quietly among the crews, repeated half in awe, half in disbelief. Faith became physics. The line summed up more than a maneuver. It described a philosophy born in desperation, when human instinct outran technology. Frank never claimed to understand what he'd done. When a war correspondent asked, he shrugged, "Guess I just trusted the mud to tell me when to move." To him, it wasn't heroism. It was rhythm and surrender. The same way he once let a dirt road decide where the car would drift. In the field journals, the officers later drew diagrams trying to reconstruct it. One even labeled the movement controlled slip, marking arrows and torque curves. But beneath the math was something else. The realization that sometimes courage is just another form of intuition. The men who saw it would carry that idea with them long after the mud had dried. Because in that moment, the laws of motion weren't just Newton's. They were human, written in the tension between fear and faith. Across the valley, through the fog and gunfire, German eyes were watching. On a ridge overlooking the swamp, Lieutenant Erich Voss of the 26th Panzer Division raised his field glasses and froze. What he saw defied logic. An American Sherman tank twisting through the mud as if guided by invisible strings. "It moves like a dancer," he muttered to his adjutant. "Ours die like statues." Later that night, Voss recorded the scene in his leather-bound diary. "I saw something that made me question everything we've built. Our machines are stronger, faster, and precise, yet theirs live." His words would survive the war, tucked into a box discovered decades later in Stuttgart, his handwriting still streaked by rain. On the American side, the radio crackled with reports that German artillery had paused. For a few strange minutes, both sides listened to the same storm, neither firing. The battlefield went quiet except for rain, thunder, and the deep hum of idling engines. One sergeant whispered, "Even the enemy's watching the show." The film footage, shot by a combat cameraman named Leo Hartwell, captured flashes of that silence. You can see men on both sides staring, their helmets dripping, their rifles forgotten. It was war, yes, but it was also theater. And every soldier was part of an audience that didn't yet understand what it had witnessed. When the reports reached headquarters, officers dismissed it as mythical exaggeration. But among the men, it became something else. A story told in tents and trenches, proof that chaos could be outwitted, that skill could look like sorcery. A month later, a German prisoner captured near Florence told his interrogator, "Your tanks, they move like they want to live." And that, perhaps, was the difference. One side built machines to dominate the world. The other built machines to adapt to it. To you watching now, if you'd been there, standing in the rain that day, which would have frightened you more? The guns, or the idea that even mud could be mastered by rhythm? Tell me in the comments, what do you think makes a soldier win? Better machines or better instincts? In the weeks that followed, the story of the tank that danced traveled faster than any official dispatch. Units from Anzio to Florence whispered about it during chow time, half believing, half doubting. Some said the driver was dead. Others said he'd been sent back to the States to train a secret corps of tank acrobats. The myth grew legs before the mud had even dried. At the Allied vehicle testing grounds near Bari, engineers replayed Hartwell's footage frame by frame. They noticed how the tank's suspension flexed and absorbed shock far better than expected. It wasn't luck. It was physics exploited at its limit. Reports soon reached Detroit, where Chrysler engineers, building the next generation of Shermans, took special interest in this so-called controlled slip technique. One memo dated March 12, 1945, read, "Driver in Italy demonstrated torque distribution efficiency beyond predicted tolerances. Recommend evaluation for potential suspension redesign." That note led directly to experiments that birthed the horizontal volute spring suspension, the HVSS system that would define post-war tanks for decades. Back on the front, soldiers had already turned it into folklore. Tank crews in France would mock one another. "Think you can dance like Davis?" The name had become legend, even though few actually knew his face. He never gave interviews. After the war, when asked about the rumor that his maneuver changed U.S. tank design, he simply said, "I just didn't want to die in the mud." To the men who'd seen it, that humility made it even more powerful. An unrecorded hero whose instinct reshaped machines. It reminded them that behind every innovation, there's always a frightened human trying to survive one impossible moment. In training manuals printed years later, the maneuver appeared as a small paragraph. Controlled slip steering technique. Utilize opposing torque to regain traction in soft terrain. No name, no credit, just a line of text born from desperation. And yet, the story outlived the war. In mess halls, in bars, in the hum of factories back home, people spoke of a man who made mud obey. If you're watching this, think about it. How many inventions were born, not in laboratories, but in the trembling hands of someone who simply refused to give up? Would you have done the same if the world was sinking beneath you? Decades later, when the war was only a memory stored in museums and fading photographs, Frank Davis returned to Italy. He was an old man now, his hands marked by time, his walk slower, but his eyes still carried the same alert calm that once guided 30 tons of steel through chaos. The Leary Valley was peaceful. Rows of crops replaced trenches, tractors replaced tanks, and the only sound was the hum of distant engines. He stopped at the edge of a field after a rain. The mud shimmered under the sun, soft, rich, alive. A young farmer waved from a distance, then went back to steering his tractor. An American-made model, its suspension built on the same principles born from that long-ago battle. Davis smiled faintly. History, he thought, always leaves traces in the ground. His grandson, a boy no older than 10, ran up beside him. "Grandpa," the child asked, pointing to the tractor's wide tires, "aren't you scared it'll slip?" Davis crouched, scooped a handful of mud, and let it slide through his fingers. "If you know how to move with it," he said, "mud isn't the enemy. It's just the floor for a dance." The boy laughed, not fully understanding. But Davis looked out across the fields and saw ghosts. Not of soldiers, but of moments. The rain, the roar, the impossible drift. A memory that had outlasted names, medals, even the manuals it inspired. When he left the valley that day, the tracks of his boots curved slightly across the wet earth, like an echo of that old, graceful slide. No one else noticed. But in that small motion, the past and present met. A man and the mud, once again, in quiet rhythm. There are stories of war that speak of destruction, and others that whisper of survival, but some, rare and fragile, reveal the beauty hidden inside struggle. Frank Davis's drift through the storm was not about victory, not even about skill. It was about harmony. Between man and machine, chaos and control, instinct and reason. In 1944, one act of courage rewrote the understanding of traction and balance. But more than that, it proved that the human spirit can find rhythm even in ruin. Detroit's engineers turned his instinct into equations. Factories built upon it, generations learned from it. Yet the essence of it remained something words could barely capture, a moment of faith made visible in motion. Perhaps that's what history really is, the quiet transformation of fear into creation, of mud into memory. Somewhere, in every act of survival, there's a hidden choreography that keeps us moving forward. And as the old soldier once said, standing before a field of rain-soaked earth, don't fight the struggle, find its rhythm, and dance with it.